The ledger Adan was built on a lie that had become so well-trodden the ground itself seemed to believe it, that everyone who lived there owned something worth protecting. That wasn't quite true. What people actually owned was access, the ability to reach certain buildings, use certain elevators, speak in rooms where decisions were made. And what kept ownership from being honest was the sheer inconvenience of explaining to anyone why one person's door opened while another's required a key you'd never been told about. The lie was maintained by men who had learned that destruction could be administered as a service, not the sudden violence of occupation or revolution, but something quieter, more expensive in its consequences than either, something delivered through committees and zoning codes, and quarterly reports that nobody actually read because nobody understood them well enough to care. It was Amara's job to make sure the reports existed at all. She worked for the Municipal Planning Authority within its Economic Restructuring Division, a name so bureaucratically bland it could have been the title of any department in any city that had ever wanted to feel modern, while quietly removing certain populations from their homes. Her desk was on the 40th floor of the Adan Administrative Building, which sat above everything else like a bird watching a nest from too far away to intervene. The old neighborhood below with its narrow streets and shops that didn't have signs in English. The middle district where most of the city's young professionals lived, the ones who worked here during the day and went somewhere else at night because they couldn't afford to sleep near their work. And above them all, the penthouse district, which contained nothing but hotels and private residences for people whose names appeared on government websites in a section marked designated contributors with no explanation attached. On her desk there was a view that made it easy to forget what she actually did. The sea through the glass, blue and indifferent as any ocean should be, with shipping containers stacked along its edge like someone had been packing things up for months without telling anyone they were leaving. That was fine because nobody would have noticed anyway. Nobody looked at the horizon when their own life felt sufficiently narrow that everything beyond it didn't matter. Her office was where she did her work, reading files, making notes, signing papers whose language had been simplified so much by time and repetition that they read like recipes. Residential Zone 7A shall be reclassified as mixed-use commercial. The current occupants of Plot 14B are hereby notified of the 3-month timeline for relocation. All assets associated with this plot shall be transferred to the Development Authority pending completion of Phase 2 of the Urban Renewal Program. She didn't sign them because she couldn't. The authority belonged to a man whose name appeared on her screen when she needed to check status but never actually did anything. That was how it worked. He thought he owned everything, which meant nobody told him that the things he was destroying weren't his to begin with. He didn't need to be told because if you were wealthy enough in Adan, being told nothing at all was exactly what your privilege looked like. On Tuesdays she ate lunch alone in the building's cafeteria, where the food was prepared by someone whose name she'd never learned, and whose face she'd only seen through a window when passing on her way to meetings with people who wore clothes that cost more than she made in 3 months combined. She told herself this wasn't normal because normal involved eating with other people about things other people wanted to talk about. But the truth was more complicated. She didn't want to be interrupted by questions she couldn't answer without sounding like someone who'd been told her own life was a story worth telling, when it was really just a series of instructions someone else had written for her. Which is how she spent most days, following scripts nobody asked you to read out loud because the volume at which they were delivered made them feel private rather than public, as if your participation in something destructive was also a kind of secret. She knew what that felt like because it was the same thing that happened to her mother's house on the edge of the old neighborhood, marked for renovation 6 years ago with a letter written in polite bureaucratic language, explaining how the city had decided that certain buildings were no longer compatible with the vision for our shared future. The renovation never came. There was no money. Nobody came to actually look at what needed fixing because nobody wanted to spend time inspecting things they'd already decided couldn't be worth saving. And then one day it just wasn't hers anymore, not because someone took it, but because she stopped paying the property tax when she realized there was nothing left inside that belonged to her except memories of a woman who'd been alive long enough to make them, and nobody else could have those anyway. The destruction had happened without anyone needing to break anything. It had just sat there until something went away entirely, like a toothache you stop worrying about because the pain has become part of your day rather than separate from it. That was how a Dan worked. You weren't destroyed when someone came at you with force. You were destroyed when everything around you quietly stopped supporting you and nobody told you why. She'd seen this happen to people in her own family. Her uncle, who owned a small grocery store on 4th Street for 20 years before the city decided that the street needed aesthetic improvement, and his shop became a parking lot because it was easier to remove one building than 300 and have to convince each owner separately that they could move. She'd seen it happen to her father's business partner, whose restaurant had been fine until the new zoning code classified the neighborhood as high-value commercial potential, and suddenly there were permits you couldn't get anymore for things he'd been doing legally since before he was even born. The patience of it made it impossible to fight. You couldn't argue against a timeline that didn't exist yet because the destruction hadn't happened when you saw it coming. It only appeared after the fact, like someone had already pulled something from your life, and now you were looking at the empty space wondering where it had been. By Wednesday, her phone rang with the same kind of calls she received on most days. Requests for information about properties that weren't hers anymore because they'd already been removed from existence in some way she understood, but couldn't explain to anyone who didn't work like this. The caller would be a man or woman, sometimes someone she knew by name, and sometimes someone whose voice was new and unfamiliar, because the city kept producing faces like hers. People whose job it was to make sure destruction moved forward without anyone asking questions that might slow it down. They were all polite about it, which made her wonder if they understood exactly what they'd signed up for, or if being polite was just something people did when they realized nobody else would be doing the hard parts of whatever was happening here. Some of them sounded like they thought they were doing good work. It's for the greater good, you know. The city needs to move forward. That phrase made her think about what the city actually meant, whether it included everyone or just certain kinds of people who happened to live there. But she didn't tell any of them that because telling someone they were wrong felt like making a scene, and nobody wanted scenes when the work had been scheduled. On Thursday morning, something changed, not dramatically, not in anything you'd notice walking down the street, but in one small thing that made her realize everything was already exactly where it needed to be. She saw her neighbor's shop across from the building closed for good. It had been open on Monday and Tuesday and maybe Wednesday too, though by then she wasn't sure anymore because sometimes people would keep their lights on even after they'd given up, hoping that if you kept showing someone a place was still there, it might make them remember to come back. The man who owned it had sat at his desk for months waiting for something he couldn't name, the way people did when they were told things wouldn't happen, and then they happened anyway because the city always found its own reasons eventually. She watched him one afternoon while walking past on her way home from a meeting where someone had told her that the next phase of the program would require a certain amount of community buy-in, which turned out to mean nothing more than getting people to sign forms saying they understood why their lives were going to change, and then accepting those changes without making too much noise about them. She didn't tell him she knew because he was already so tired that anything new felt like something you added on top of exhaustion rather than replacing it. And the last thing someone needed when everything had already been taken away was for someone else to explain what they should have known all along. It was on Friday evening that Amara finally looked at her desk in a way she'd never done before, not because anything there had changed, but because she wanted to see how much of this work belonged to it, how many papers and files and signatures she'd been responsible for making happen without anyone having to know whose hands were holding them when they moved the pieces. She counted, there was no exact number, but it felt like enough, that in her time at the authority she had helped remove approximately 43 buildings from their original locations, reclassified 12 neighborhoods as commercial zones, and approved 117 relocation notices for people who'd already been living somewhere else because they didn't have anywhere to go anymore. She thought about how the word patience was supposed to sound in this context, how it could mean something noble when you were on the side of the thing being protected, but cruel when you understood what you were watching happen and couldn't do anything except sit there and let the world rearrange itself around people who'd been told their lives didn't matter enough to keep. The next morning she went to work as usual, opened her computer like anyone would, logged into the system where names appeared in lists marked with status codes that meant something only to someone inside, pending for things waiting to happen, approved for things already decided but not yet visible anywhere except here, and completed for things that had been removed from existence without anyone being able to point at anything and say exactly when it had stopped existing. She scrolled through the list until she found a property she knew about, her uncle's old grocery store on 4th Street, which now appeared in the system under a new classification with 3 months remaining before its final removal, a number that wasn't quite accurate because nothing ever happened on exact schedules in Adan, but it was close enough to make people feel like they were still inside something that had rules. She thought about her mother sitting in the empty house she'd once called home and wondering why nobody would come fix anything when everything needed fixing at once. The roof, the plumbing, the walls that weren't quite straight anymore because they'd been built by someone who hadn't measured properly or perhaps hadn't cared enough to measure. She thought about how her mother had been told the city was improving things, how that phrase could mean so many different things depending on whether you were looking at it from above where improvements meant new buildings and better roads, or from below where they meant old ones being taken away because someone decided they weren't worth keeping anymore. She closed the computer screen without saving anything she'd been working on because there was nothing to save. There wasn't a way to preserve work that had already been completed by the time you looked at it and realized what it actually did, how it made destruction look like progress if you were willing to ignore everything happening inside those walls while someone else sat in an office with a view of the sea and counted the buildings being removed from their original locations. On her way home that evening, she walked past the closed shop one more time because something about seeing it empty felt like watching something disappear without anyone having to do anything visible. No demolition crews, no trucks, no signs saying "We are coming for you." Just a door left open too long and now swinging freely in a breeze nobody could feel because they'd forgotten what wind was supposed to feel like. She thought about the quote she'd read last night while lying awake at home, the one about infinite patience and infinite precision, and how it could describe almost anything. The way a government dismantled its own population through paperwork, the way a family slowly lost everything without anyone breaking anything on purpose, the way you learn to live with the fact that your life was being administered by people who thought of themselves as servants rather than destroyers, because the line between those things had become so thin that crossing it felt like walking through fog. She got home and sat at her kitchen table where someone's coffee cup always waited for her, though lately it hadn't been David's anymore. David was living in another city now where there were fewer committees and more people who understood what you'd already lost without needing to explain why. But the cup she drank from that evening had a blue stripe on its side like hers, because sometimes things stayed with you longer than people thought they should, even when everything else had been carefully removed. She thought about how the city worked. It was all made of decisions someone had made years ago and then kept making every day without anyone noticing. Those decisions were actually choices rather than inevitabilities, like gravity. Necessary but never quite understood because nobody wanted to think about what would happen if you stopped believing in it long enough to make something else possible. Outside the window she could see lights moving along streets that had been designed for certain kinds of people who drove cars they couldn't afford and still somehow managed anyway, which was part of how Adan worked. Everyone could live here but nobody actually owned anything except the small things you couldn't take away without making everyone look bad. The memories, the habits, the knowledge of where everything used to be before someone decided it should be somewhere else. She sat at the table and thought about nothing for a long time because thinking felt like an effort she didn't have any more, After all those days spent reading lists that told her when things stopped being real, when buildings became numbers on a screen and houses became addresses nobody would ever go to again because they'd been removed from existence before anyone could remember them. And somewhere across town, in offices with views of the sea, men were making decisions about what the city should look like next year, and the one after that, until patience ran out entirely, and nothing remained except the architecture of someone's idea of progress, built carefully brick by invisible brick, while people who'd once lived there watched their streets become something they couldn't recognize anymore because everything had been rearranged without anyone asking them where anything was supposed to go.